what is going on, everybody? Today I will be showing you how to draw a control flow graph for loops in specific. I'll be using examples from the video quiz, so if you also want to see how far I'll explain it, which I do recommend, go ahead and check out the video quizzes. And a quick note for fall 2024 class, I will be a little bit inactive. You can see that whiteboard, it says like 16 days left. Graduate applications are coming soon and I'm just revising my essays multiple times. But I'll be doing this video because it was a commonly missed question on the exam, so let's get to it. Basic things to remember is that we cannot forget our start circle and our end circle. We also need to have arrows whenever we're doing our edges. They need to have arrowheads to determine where we're going. Next, we're going to discuss the difference between a parallelogram and rectangle. The main difference is whenever you're doing something that's user related, like an input statement, which is getting something from the user, or a print statement, which is outputting something to the user, we need to use a parallelogram to indicate that we are actually interacting with them. Anything else, like assignment functions, math, anything else, would just be a normal rectangle. For conditional statements like if-else statements and loops, we will be using a diamond because a diamond has these two little edges right here where you can say this happens when it's true or this happens when it's false. Note, a parallelogram will take precedence over a rectangle. What does that mean? An example like this where we have a normal function like an int function, but we have an input inside of it, it'll be a parallelogram because we are interacting with the user. So to begin, let's first analyze this code and see what we may need to do. As you can see, we already have one clear parallelogram right there because it's an input statement. ACC equals to 0 just initializes something, so that could be just a rectangle. And because we have a for loop, we need to remember to initialize the variable num because a for loop automatically does that. We also need to remember that loops are basically like conditionals, but they wrap around themselves. While this is true, basically, it'll keep iterating the code inside here, but if it's not true, that's when we finally break out of the loop and we go print out the statement. So to begin, we need to remember to include our start circle. Alright, next up, we cannot forget to include our arrow with the arrowhead. And now we can get to our first line of code where it's max num is equal to int input. And because we have input, it'll be a parallelogram. Alright, there we go. Now, whenever I draw a parallelogram, I draw the sides first to make sure it's clear that it's a parallelogram. And after we do that, let's draw one more arrow. It's a good idea to keep your arrows for these simple ones small so that we have enough room to fit it on the paper. So next up, the next line of code is to initialize the variable ACC is equal to 0. This is short for accumulator because as you can see here, it's accumulating whatever num is in the range of max num. So we can do ACC is equal to 0. And because there's no user interaction here, we can just make it a rectangle. All right, so after we do that, we are now going into our loop. Now remember why I underlined this. We create a variable num, or we initialize it, and we're going to keep going until this is higher than max num, basically. So let's do another arrow, small one. Num is equal to 0. I'm not sure if this is required, but we can make a little note here that says we are initializing something. Alfaro does it in the video, so it'd be safe to make a little comment right here saying what you're initializing for the loop. So after we have initialized that, we can now get into the loop, and because it's a loop, it's going to be a diamond. Before we do that, we need to figure out what this is doing. Essentially, in English, this is saying keep doing this line of code under the loop while num is less than max num. So the English way is num is less than max num. We can draw a diamond here. A little bit messy, but yeah, let's do the arrow here. And now we need to label what happens when this condition is true and when it is false. So when it is true, we're gonna indicate that by going down here, label it as true. Don't forget your labels because this is very important. And it seems like we are just adding whatever num is to ACC, and because that is not user related, we have to do a rectangle. All right, so because it's also a for loop and not a while loop you'll see code where it says something like num plus equals 1 or num equals num plus 1. In this scenario, it's not totally clear, but a for loop automatically adds 1 to num right here. So we need to remember to add that. So we need to do num is equal to num plus 1. Oops, accidentally did that. And we will also leave a little note that says we are changing the variable. So basically num right here is kind of acting like a counter to iterate through the loop. So next up, because that is all we have in this line of code, we are now going to loop around back to the diamond. This is the difference between conditional statements and loops. Loops kind of wrap back around each other. That's why it forms a little loop in the name. Whereas conditional statements, they don't ever come back to each other. They either go true or false. So because this line of code is now finished, we're going to draw an arrow right here, indicating a loop, showing that we're actually going back. Now, our next situation is when this statement is false. Once it is false, that's when we're finished executing this line of code, and now we're going to print ACC. So, it's a good idea to always try your best to leave your diagram top to bottom format rather than to the side. That might be important. I'm not totally sure on that, but just to be safe, try and have it like a top to bottom format like how I have it. So rather than the arrow just pointing outwards here, we're gonna make it wrap all the way down. Don't forget to label this as false. All right, and once we have labeled that as false, we can now print it. And because printing is showing something to the user, it is related to the user, so this is gonna be a parallelogram. So, and then we draw the parallelogram. All right, now, you may think that we are finished, but it is very important to remember that we need our end circle. This can be very, you can do the exam and you might be excited to finish this finally, you can move on to another question, but remember, do not forget your end circle. We don't want to, oh, well, that's a horrible circle, but you get the point. We don't want to lose free points like that, guys. So remember, try not to rush this. Make sure you have everything. Ask yourself questions like, okay, did I label everything? Are the shapes correct? Did I include my circles? And does it look right? So this is an example of the visualization of doing a for loop. A while loop is very similar to this. Rather than implicitly initializing it, a while loop would actually explicitly do it. You can see it in the code. It might look something like I is equal to 0, and inside of the while loop, it'll do I plus equals 1. But yeah, this is how to draw. Recap, user-related stuff has to be a parallelogram. Everything else, a rectangle is fine. Don't forget your circles. Label, if you're using a conditional statement or a loop. Arrows on the arrowheads on the arrows, and yeah, other than that, that should be it. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and ask on Ed, but be sure to practice this because this is pretty important. So yeah, have a good one, guys.